time, the indefinite future. 1983, suggested one critic, Doomsday Eve. Alex and his friends, teenage hoodlums, sit in the Corova bar drinking milk plus drugs, perfectly legal, and sharpening up their appetites for the night's adventures. A bit of the old ultra-violence, as Alex says. Beating up a drunk, fighting a rival gang, stealing cars, rape. Alex, supremely confident, absolutely cold-blooded, yet with a strong sense of irony and humor, and a lover of Beethoven as well. Home for Alex, a modern high-rise apartment, tasteless and continually vandalized. After one grotesque assault, Alex, who has angered his friends by bullying them, is left to the police, injured, but as always, self-assured and scheming. In prison, he ingratiates himself with the authorities and is chosen for an experiment in chemotherapy. He will be released as a man deprived of free will. Violence and sex will so sicken him that he will do anything, even lick his jailer's shoes, to escape the sickness. Released, he is recognized by one of his old victims, whose friends beat him up. Alex, of course, cannot defend himself. The violence is unbearable to him. He soon falls into the hands of his old gang, who are now policemen. They, too, revenge themselves on him with a savage beating. Nearly dead, Alex finds refuge, as luck would have it, at the home of another of his old victims. He now becomes a pawn in political intrigue, alternately safe and helpless. At the film's end, he is society's hero. That is the story of Stanley Kubrick's film, A Clockwork Orange, released by Warner Brothers and at once voted the best motion picture of 1971 by the New York film critics. Today on Camera 3, an examination, including attention to the film's links with the book from which it comes, the unusual musical score, and excerpts from the film itself. With us are Anthony Burgess, author of the novel A Clockwork Orange, Malcolm McDowell, who stars in the film as Alex, and cinema historian William Everson.
Stanley Kubrick is one of the most dynamic and individual directors to hit the American cinema since Orson Welles in 1940. Kubrick's career began in the early 1950s with fairly unambitious films made economically and fairly cheaply, but somehow each film that he made turned out to be twice as good as the film that preceded it. Films like Fear and Desire, Killer's Kiss, The Killing, Paths of Glory, Spartacus, Lolita, on, of course, into Dr. Strangelove. Obviously, the leveling off point had to come somewhere, and I suppose that at Dr. Strangelove he'd reached such a peak that it was no longer possible to make each film twice as good as the one that came before it. But certainly from then on, each film he made, and there's only been two big ones, 2001, A Space Odyssey, and the current film, A Clockwork Orange, have been really unusual, spectacular, extremely ambitious productions, ostensibly uncommercial ones, but films that turned out eventually to be extremely commercial in every sense of the word, and films that attracted tremendous critical acclaim. Kubrick obviously is a director of tremendous dedication to his art and to the cinema, and also a man of great autonomy. Nobody tells Kubrick what to do, he just makes his films the way he wants to. Obviously this is the way that Stroheim and Wells and Chaplin worked too. Great masterpieces can be made that way, but also at times great disasters. And Kubrick is a man that is not easy to work with and is known to work by the method of perhaps making his own mistakes and correcting them rather than trying to avoid those mistakes in the first place. But since we have with us today Mr. McDowell, who's worked with him throughout the entire production of Clockwork Orange as the star, I'd like to ask you, Mr. McDowell, if you have any comment to make on Kubrick's working methods with you, whether there was great friction, how the role was interpreted.
Well, I'd have to disagree on one point, that he is not difficult to work with. I don't know where you got that from. Maybe other actors have found him difficult. I certainly didn't find him difficult to work with. This was a monumental film, and a monumental part, Alex. It's impossible to say how it was done. I mean,
perhaps I should have said rigid rather than difficult. In other words, he has his own fixed ideas and is not prone to take too many suggestions. Well, if I'm wrong, please correct me.
I'll have to, because that is wrong. Stanley, why he's such a great director, for me anyway, is that he can create the atmosphere for creative work, which is very important. I mean, he takes an awful lot from his actors. He has to. His method of working is not to give you directions like you come in, you go from A to B, and you sit down and you talk. That would be impossible to do a film in that way. Totally impossible. His method is that we come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and we rehearse. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse until we get the scene right. And by saying rehearse, I mean that everybody is there to throw in ideas. For instance, a scene in the film where Alex and his 3 droogs come in and rape a writer's wife and beat the writer up. We arrived at the set, looked at the bare walls for 3 days. We rehearsed various bits of the script that we had which weren't good enough. I mean, it just wasn't working for us. And so on the 3rd day, Stanley said to me, can you dance? And I said, yes, why not, you know. I mean, I'm not a dancer, but I went into a sort of soft shoe number and started to hum, doo-dee-doo, da-da-ba-dee-ba-dee-ba-ba-doo-ba, and then started to sing, Singing in the Rain, because subconsciously I remembered that scene in the Gene Kelly film as being one of the happiest scenes I'd ever seen on the film, and it was right for the moment, and Kubrick took this immediately. Within 3 hours he had the rights of the song. So, I mean, he's not rigid in any sense. He's very elastic when he's working. And he may be rigid afterwards or before on the technical side of the filming and on the distribution and the advertising, etc. But certainly when he's working in a creative way, I mean, that's when you're actually making the film, and that's the only important thing. You know, I mean, it's no good having a great distribution setup if you've got no film.
Of course.
And he certainly is, he's not rigid.
Well, I'm glad to be so informed. Let me turn the limelight for a moment to you, Mr. Burgess. It must be rather unique for a writer of such a individual and stylized book not to work on the screenplay itself. And it does seem rather strange to me that a film like this, which is a very difficult and symbolic kind of story, which has a very equally difficult and symbolic title, for it to be rather an affectation not to explain that title in the film itself. I think perhaps because there was so much controversy over 2001, which turned out to be a very profitable controversy, perhaps Kubrick, with his sort of cult of followers, was hoping that people would delve into the meaning of the film and find all sorts of meanings which may or may not have been there. But the fact is, there are no clues in the film unless one has read your book. The title doesn't become apparent. Perhaps you might even now explain the title for us.
Well, the title has a very definite meaning, but only to a particular generation of London Cockneys. It's a phrase which I heard many years ago and so fell in love with, I wanted to use it as a title for a book. But the phrase itself I did not make up. It's the phrase, as queer as a clockwork orange, is good old East London slang. And it didn't seem to be necessary to explain it. Now, obviously, I have given it an extra meaning. I've implied an extra dimension. I've implied the junction of the organic, the lively, the sweet, in other words, life, the orange, and the mechanical, the cold, the disciplined, and brought them together into this kind of oxymoron, I think is the term, this sour-sweet word.
And in the book you do come back to it fairly frequently.
It is partly explained in the book. The symbolism is glanced at, and of course in the book itself that the writer who is beaten up is writing such a book. And when I wrote the script myself, like many other people who wrote a script, I turned the author in the book into myself. I made him Burgess. Well, Stanley obviously read the script, although he didn't use it, and something of this must have stuck in his mind because he called Alex Burgess. The name was, he was aware that there was a close personal tie-up with the whole process of of writing and suffering for writing, and a kind of very powerful nexus of symbolism was hanging around somewhere there. But I think he was right not to do any facile explanation. Anybody who knows Cockney slang will know the term. Anybody who doesn't can give a meaning to it.
Yes.
There were some sophistos from the TV studios around the corner, laughing and greeting. The debauchko was smacking away and not caring about the wicked world one bit. Then the disc on the stereo twanged off and out. and in the short silence before the next one came on, she suddenly came with a burst of singing. And it was like, for a moment, oh my brothers, some great bird had flown into the milk bar, and I felt all the melanky little hairs on my plot standing endwise, and the shivers crawling up like slow melanky lizards, and then down again, because I knew what she sang. It was a bit from the Glorious Ninth by Ludwig van.
What did you do that for?
For being a bastard with no manners. Not a duke of an idea how to comport yourself public-wise, oh my brother.
I don't like you should do what you've done. And I'm not your brother no more and wouldn't want to be.
Watch that. Do watch that old dimmer to continue to be on live. Thou dost wish.
Yarballs. Great bolsy yard blockhouse to you. I'll meet you with chain or nods or blither any time. Not having you aiming tall jocks at me reasonless. But it stands to reason I won't have it.
A nod scrap any time you say.
Doobie-doo. A bit tired, maybe. That's not the same, Mom. Bed ways is right ways now. So best we go home ways and get a bit of spatchka. Right? Right.
A bit of spatchka. Spatchka, sleep. A Clockwork Orange borrows dozens of foreign words to form its own slang. Malchik, boy. Chelovek, fellow. And Petitsa, bird in the sense of a girl, a chick, are all straight from the Russian. Anthony Burgess, a Joyce scholar, gives other Russian words a Joycean twist into English. Odinok, lonesome, becomes Odinoki. Militia becomes Millicent's, policeman. Korosho is spoken as horror show, meaning good. The past tense ending makes an English word of the Russian for drink. Kishka is pluralized to mean guts. And the Korova milk bar, while Alex and his droogs plan their mayhem, is aptly named for the Russian for cow. Like the Teddy Boys who flourished when Mr. Burgess wrote his novel, the Cheloveks of Clockwork Orange treat their own mother tongue endearingly. Egweg, Appy Polylogy for apology, P&M for pa and ma.
In the wake of 1984, there's been an increasing number of films and books built around the premise of a rather depressing and politically motivated future in this country and in England. A number of films such as Privilege, Wild in the Streets, Punishment Park, all of them presenting a rather depressing and grim picture of life in the future. I'm afraid that I'm rather too fond of England to think it'll change that rapidly over there. They're just too slow and they're changing. But certainly these films have represented a very definite trend of thought, which almost seems to be replacing science fiction as the way to engulf audiences in fact and melodrama, which isn't that improbable at all. And certainly the Clockwork Orange, which was written in 63, I believe, Mr. Burgess?
62.
62,
It was written in 61, published 62.
Was one of the first of this kind of novel, and it was some time before it could be made into a film at all. The rights for a film version were sold initially in 1963, I believe, or 64, with the intention of making it with initially Mike Jagger and then later on the Beatles. But at that particular time, the British censors were particularly rigid in any kind of themes of violence, and they claimed then it could just never be made at all. Many, many worthwhile projects at that time were being turned down because of sensorial interference. And so the project was delayed indefinitely. Terry Southern himself did one script which was not used, but he finally showed the property to Stanley Kubrick. And it was Mr. Kubrick who finally did his own version, his own script, and the film finally emerged many, many years later. But I think in view of the fact that so many films and plays and novels were built around this particular theme, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Burgess, just how you conceive this particular story which I think overlaps in some ways with many of her other books that have this similar kind of rather depressing view of the future.
Well, it isn't really depressing. Well, it's not depressing to me. I'm not capable of being depressed very much. It's very simple. I was brought up as a Catholic in the north of England, and I was brought up to accept the doctrine of original sin, which I still accept under various other nominal guises. I think that man is probably inherently bad or inherently antisocial. And but yet, in a sense, man's original sin is a product of his own will. He willed it himself, and by a curious paradox, this will is rather a glorious thing to possess. There's a terrible statement made by St. Augustine, which all Christians like to forget. But what he said about the fall of Adam, was this: "Oh, happy fault, since it produced so great a Redeemer." In other words, the Orthodox Christian must feel the fall from grace, the fall from the Garden of Eden, was a good thing, because it produced Christ. And it's a good thing on a secular level, because it indicated man's desire to make his own life, to work his will, to make mistakes, and in the process of making mistakes, produce as kind of byproducts things like art and beauty and the like. Out of this powerful libido of Alex, for instance, in the book and in the film, there is also cognate with it a realization of the beauty of music, the beauty of the world, the beauty of language. Alex is a man in that he is violent, as men are. He loves beauty and he loves language. And these three things go all together. If you produce a human being without the will to do evil, you produce a human being without the will to do anything, and certainly not the will to create. So this is not, in my view, a gloomy view of man at all. It's a fairly realistic view of what man is like. And the book and also the film represent a kind of fabulous treatment of this human condition. It is not the future, really. It can be the future if you will. It's just a period of time which is at a slant to real time.
Well, America perhaps, but not London, I hope. You mentioned the beauty of language. Can you tell us something about how you devised the particular Russian-oriented language that's used in the film?
Well, the alternative to using a slang of my own was to use an existing slang, which would date too rapidly. It would date in a year. It would date, in fact, between the writing of the book and its publication. And certainly 10 years after the writing and publishing of the book, the language would smell of lavender. So I had to invent a dialect of my own, and by chance I went to Russia, found that in Russia there were the same problems with teenagers as we had in the West, and it struck me I could create a kind of composite teenager who would speak a language compounded of Russian and English and American, and so.
Excuse me, brother. I ordered this 2 weeks ago. Can you see if it's arrived yet, please?
Just a minute.
Pardon me, ladies. Enjoying that, are you, my darling? Bit cold and pointless, isn't it, my lovely? What's happened to yours, my little sister?
Who you getting, Bratty? Goggly Go-Go? Johnny Zhivago? The Heaven 17?
What you got back home, little sister, to play your fuzzy warbles on? I bet you got little, say, pitiful, portable picnic players. Come with Uncle and hear all proper. Hear angel trumpets and devil trombones. You are invited.
This is the electronic music studio of Walter Carlos and Rachel Elkin, where much of the music of A Clockwork Orange was made. Classical music plays as important a role in the film as it did in Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Some of it is straight, but much of it was remade on electronic synthesizing equipment. Carlos is well known for his records, switched on Bach and the well-tempered synthesizer. For Clockwork Orange, he created new performances of Purcell's Music for the Funeral of Queen Mary, Rossini's William Tell Overture, and most spectacularly, selections from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. For the Ode to Joy sequence, Carlos used the voice encoder with elements of the Moog to vary the pitch of the vocal line as articulated by Elkind. This is one of the many techniques used in the creation of synthetic music.
The film, of course, adds many dimensions of its own. Language is one. The visuals of the film somehow enable one to accept quite clearly the often quite difficult meaning of some of the slang Russian-oriented phrases. Somehow, because of the way the scenes are designed and set up, you know automatically what the expression currently being used means, even though there's no obvious explanation for it. I think the use of music, too, is another important asset and adjunct to the film. Quite apart from the importance of the Beethoven music as a part of the plot, it somehow adds a kind of formal and timeless quality to the film. You can somehow look at this film as though you were seeing it in 2000 looking back, rather than the 1970s looking forward. I think it adds a great deal of formality of the film, which really helps it a tremendous amount. And also, of course, it's a tremendously stylized film in so many ways. And stylization in film is not a thing that usually works very well. I think one of the best examples is a 1927 film by F.W. Murnau called Sunrise, which is a very warm human love story of two people, in which the story itself is totally realistic and totally warm, but in which the acting and the set design and the decor is very much formalized and stylized in a very unusual Germanic way. And yet it works superbly well. The film is unrealistic, and yet it convinces you with its realism. Conversely, though, I think Kubrick in A Clockwork Orange goes in exactly the opposite direction. For the most part, the film is shot on location. It uses perhaps bizarre landscape settings and modernistic buildings, but he does use actual existing locations, and he creates with these very real buildings a nightmare world all his own. I think the only bizarre set sort of specifically built for the film is the opening scene, the opening set of the very erotic or exotic night milk bar at the very beginning. Am I right in that? Is that the only sort of unusual outre set that they built for the film?
Yes. In fact, we only built, I think it was 3 sets in all. The Korova milk bar, the one that you mentioned, a passageway, and the prison check-in. That was the only 3 sets that were built. The Korova, I think he got the idea for the statues. He saw an exhibition of, forgotten the sculptor's name, but he saw an exhibition in London of these sculptors, and he decided to use that.
I was wondering how you felt about sequences that have been added to the screenplay that you actually hadn't written. I'm thinking of one sequence in particular which, for me, I think helps the film tremendously. The sequence which Alex is back in the house of the author whom we assaulted before. And in your book, you obviously, since the story is narrated by Alex himself, he can't tell the reader what the writer or what other events are taking place. But of course, Kubrick can come outside of that narrative, and he shows you events building up to kind of almost Hitchcockian suspense build-up, and it works extremely well in the film. How do you feel about those additions?
Oh, I was very pleased with the particular one you mentioned, where Alex is eating spaghetti bolognese and drinking wine, and It has the quality of an improvisation, which is admirable, I feel. It's very free-moving. And it's the kind of link, it's a link which is obviously a very cinematic conception, but it finds a parallel in the book. It's the exact cinematic parallel of the kind of sequence I had in the book, which is a little more complex than the one we have here. But the job done in the film is probably a little better than the job done by my own sequence in the book, because it's a lot simpler. And so I've nothing but praise for the way he's found these equivalents, these cinematic equivalents for these literary conceptions.
Mm-hmm. Having seen the film now and knowing what can be done with your work, do you think in future you'll be liable to write perhaps in a more cinematic way to make it easier, or
I always have written in a cinematic way. I always conceive a novel in terms of scenes.
Well, for example, this particular book is written around basically about one character.
Yes.
And since he's telling his own story, it's very difficult to know just what sort of character he really is. He's more of a symbol than an individual. Must have been very difficult for you to interpret that part.
Yes, because, as you rightly say, I couldn't find any realistic parallels to work within, you see. And one was playing this force, this evil force, if you like, and one had to make it a real person, in a sense, and a real personality. And I did find that difficult at the beginning. But then it just, Bog and his holy angels in heaven sent me the answer. I don't know how it happened. It just evolved, you know. I mean, the first day was terrifying, absolutely nightmarish. We shot a scene in the hospital, the Ludovico hospital, where I'm having breakfast, and I hadn't really got a clue, you know, what I was doing, really. I was basically saying the lines and just hoping that it was right. And when we saw the rushes the next evening, Stanley said, you know, that's right, that's, we've got it, you know, that's it. And on the way home, I remember I thought to myself, well, now, what was it? I can't remember quite what I did do, you know. It's just one of those things that happens on a film. It's something that's impossible, really, to describe how you arrived at it. The answer is on the screen.
Yes. How soon was that opening close-up of the film shot? Well into the progress of the film, or did they establish that quickly?
That close-up was shot, I should say, halfway through. Obviously, we did the two Kurova scenes together. You know, you go to one location, you shoot all the stuff there, and move on to the next one. The F. Alexander stuff at his house was all shot. So before the treatment and after were shot together. And it's interesting talking about the wine sequence and the spaghetti, how that was done. I mean, Stanley introduced this character, this strong man, this Charles Atlas, Mr. Universe, because he said, you know, well, why don't you just get up and walk out of the house? Which was, in fact, a good point. And the wine sequence was determined by this strong man sitting on my left, who was liable to sort of just pick me up and tear me to shreds. So that's the kind of tension, the pulling tensions in the scene, just come really from that one idea.
Well, that worked very well. I was very pleased with it.
Yeah.
I think the whole film worked extremely well.